Margaret Ellison snatched the 3 coins out of Warren Caldwell's hand before he finished extending them, closed her fist so tight the edges bit into her palm, and looked him dead in the eye. "I'll take all 40, she said. The dock workers stopped moving. One of them actually laughed out loud, a short, disbelieving bark, because the woman standing in front of Warren Caldwell was a plus-size widow with a cracked wagon and a 17-year-old mare, and she had just paid $3 for 40 barrels of rot that grown men refused to touch. If your heart is already pounding, you are exactly where you need to be. Hit that subscribe button right now and ride this story all the way to the end, because what Margaret does with those 40 barrels is going to shake something loose in your chest that you didn't know was still there. And before we go one word further, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from today. I want to see how far this woman's story has traveled. Now let's go all the way back, because you need to understand exactly what kind of woman picks up 40 barrels of ruined cider and calls it an opportunity. She had been awake since 3 in the morning, not by choice. Sleep had become an unreliable visitor. Since Thomas died, it showed up when it felt like it, and left without warning, and Margaret had long since stopped chasing it. She had lain in the dark, listening to the farmhouse settle around her, the old timber groaning in the April cold, the wind finding every crack it could, and she had done what she did most mornings before the sun came up. She had counted $63.40 owed to First Mercantile Bank of Harrow Creek, $11 and some change in the tin beneath the kitchen floorboard. 2 months before the bank stopped being patient and started being a different kind of problem entirely. 2 hens that were laying, one that had stopped, a fence post on the eastern edge that wouldn't survive another serious wind, an apple crop that was budding tentatively, the way everything on this farm seemed to do things now, tentatively, uncertainly, as if it too wasn't sure it was going to make it through the season. She had risen before the sun, dressed in the dark, and gone to the barn, because the barn at least gave her something to do with her hands. By the time she hitched Clover to the wagon and drove into Harrow Creek to sell 2 eggs and see if Mrs. Garner still needed her sewing work, the morning arithmetic had not improved. That was the state Margaret Ellison was in when she turned the corner near Caldwell's warehouse and smelled 40 barrels of ruined cider from 30 feet away. She pulled Clover to a stop without thinking. The mare tossed her head. "I know," Margaret said. "Give me a minute." Warren Caldwell was standing in the warehouse doorway with his arms crossed and his expression dark, watching his dock workers roll barrels out into the April air with the slow, aggrieved movements of men who had been asked to do something they objected to. The barrels were old, stained dark, weeping residue through the staves. 40 of them, lined up along the dock like a problem that had no solution. Holt, the big red-faced man she recognized from the back pew at church, glanced up as Margaret climbed down from the wagon. He said nothing. That was its own kind of greeting in this town. Caldwell noticed her a moment later. Mrs. Ellison. His tone was the careful, efficient courtesy of a man who considered the conversation already finished. "I wouldn't stand too close. The smell gets into your clothing." "What happened to them?" Margaret asked. "Bad apple crop from the Henderson farm. Didn't catch the problem until after they'd been barreled and sealed." He waved a hand. "Now they're a liability. I need the space. What are you planning to do with them?" He looked at her then, really looked, the way men in Harrow Creek had been looking at her for 2 years, taking in her size, her plain dress, the wagon with the splintered sideboard, the mare with the graying muzzle. She could see him building his conclusion before she had finished asking the question. "Dump them in the river," he said. "I'd pay a man to haul them out, but my boys are already refusing to touch them past today." "What would you pay?" That surprised him. She could see it, a small recalibration behind his eyes, the expression of a man whose script had just gone off in an unexpected direction. "For hauling away 40 barrels of ruined cider." He almost smiled. $3 for the whole job. $3. Margaret looked at the barrels. She looked at her wagon. She looked at Clover's graying muzzle. She thought about her grandmother Ruth, standing in a Pennsylvania cellar, with a lantern and a stained apron, tapping the side of a soured barrel with one knotted finger. Don't ever let somebody else decide what something is worth before you've had a proper look at it yourself. I'll take them, Margaret said. Caldwell blinked. All 40? All 40, he stared at her, and she let him stare, because she had learned that the most powerful thing a woman in her position could do was refuse to fill a silence that wasn't hers to fill. You understand they're ruined, he said finally. Not salvageable for anything. I understand that perfectly well. And you have somewhere to put 40 barrels. I have a barn. Something crossed his face then, not quite pity, not quite amusement. Something in between, the expression of a man who has decided a situation, is sad and slightly entertaining in equal measure. All right, he said. $3 when the last barrel leaves my property. They shook hands. His grip was brief. Behind her, Holt muttered something she wasn't meant to hear. The laughter that followed was meant for her to hear just fine. Margaret walked back to her wagon without turning around. She had learned not to turn around. Loading 12 barrels onto a wagon with 2 hands and 1 aging mare was brutal work. The barrels were heavier than she'd expected, and the smell intensified when they moved a sour, stinging wave that made her eyes water. Her back was screaming by the end of the first load. Her palms were raw. She drove home, unloaded in the barn, and drove back. 3 trips, 6 hours of work. When Caldwell handed her the 3 coins at the end of it, he did so with the careful courtesy of a man trying to perform respect for someone he didn't fully see. I hope they're of some use to you, Mrs. Ellison, he said. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell, she said. She drove home in the last of the afternoon light, with her hands aching and her back ruined, and something moving in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. She had a plan. That night she sat at the kitchen table with Thomas's ledger open in front of her, and wrote at the top of a clean page in her careful, even hand. 40 barrels. Acquired April 14, 1856. Cost $3. Then she wrote everything she could remember about her grandmother's vinegar method. The mother culture, the living organism Ruth had called it, the thing that drove the whole transformation. The airflow, the warmth, the patience, the months it required. The signs that told you a barrel was going right or going wrong. She wrote until the candle burned low. Then she closed the ledger, pressed her hand flat against the cover, and said quietly to the empty kitchen, I'm going to make this work, Thomas. The silence answered her the way it always did. She went to bed anyway. In the morning she had a new problem. She knew the theory. Her grandmother's memory and her own good mind had given her the shape of the thing. But theory without practical knowledge failed you at exactly the moment it mattered most, and Margaret was not willing to risk everything on memory alone. She needed Agatha Whitmore. Everyone in Harrow Creek knew about Agatha, though most of them preferred knowing about her from a distance. 71 years old, lived alone 5 miles outside of town. Sharp black eyes that measured you without asking permission. A knowledge of traditional preservation methods that most people called remarkable and a few people called unsettling, depending on their disposition. Margaret had met her twice at the market. Both times, Agatha had looked at her as though she was reading something written underneath Margaret's ordinary surface. The morning after she acquired the barrels, Margaret hitched Clover and drove out to see her. She brought the last of her eggs and a jar of apple butter she had been saving, because she was not the kind of woman who arrived empty-handed. And because she understood instinctively that Agatha Whitmore's knowledge was not something given away free to strangers. Agatha came to the door before Margaret finished knocking. She stood there for a moment looking. Margaret Ellison, she said. Not a question. Yes, ma'am. Heard you bought Caldwell's ruined cider. Margaret blinked. Small town, Agatha said simply. Come in. She set the kettle on without being asked and sat across from Margaret at the kitchen table and looked at her steadily the way a woman looks at another woman when she is deciding whether the thing in front of her is what it appears to be. "What do you know about vinegar making?" she asked. "My grandmother made it from soured cider," Margaret said. "She taught me the principles. The mother culture, the airflow, the temperature, the time. But I haven't done it myself, and I can't afford to get it wrong." "No," Agatha said. "You can't. I have 40 barrels. If even half convert properly, I'll have a product I can sell. The vinegar market in this county, I know the vinegar market better than you do." Agatha's voice wasn't unkind. It was simply exact. "Sit still, Mrs. Ellison. You're nervous and it's making the room feel crowded." Margaret sat still. Agatha looked at her for another long moment. "Are you the kind of woman who finishes what she starts?" she asked. "I'm learning to be," Margaret said. Something shifted in Agatha's expression, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. "Good enough," she said. "Now tell me exactly what condition those barrels are in." What followed was 2 hours of instruction that were worth more than any sum Margaret could have paid. Agatha described the process with the precision of someone who had done it 100 times and forgotten nothing. She named the mistakes exactly. Specifically, the mistakes that ruined batches, and precisely why each mistake happened and how to see it coming before the damage was done. She told Margaret which barrels were likely still salvageable and which were probably already beyond help, based on what Margaret described of the smell and the staining on the staves. At the door, Agatha pressed a small crock into Margaret's hands sealed with cloth, containing something dark and thick. "The mother culture," Agatha said. "Introduce it to each barrel carefully. One at a time. Don't rush. How long before I know if it's working?" 4 months if you're lucky, and if I'm not lucky." Agatha looked at her with those sharp, black eyes. "Then you'll know that too," she said. "Either way, you'll learn something. That's not nothing." Margaret drove home with the crock in her lap, held carefully against the jolting of the road, and thought about what it meant to be a woman who learned things. The weeks that followed were unlike anything she had lived before. She worked the barrels every day. She moved them, repositioned them, learned by slow trial which corners of the barn ran cold in the early morning, and which caught enough afternoon warmth to be useful. She dragged barrels she couldn't lift by herself, using a rope and a system of leverage that took her 3 days to engineer and left her arms trembling at the end of each session. She kept notes on everything. Every barrel had an entry in Thomas's ledger date treated, temperature she estimated, smell, color, any change she observed. The columns filled up with her careful handwriting, and she read back through them every Sunday evening, looking for patterns, looking for mistakes before they became disasters. And all the while the town talked. The woman who bought trash. That one started within the first week. The fool with 40 rotten barrels. That one came from Holt. She found out later, but she had suspected from the beginning. Mrs. Eleanor Harker, who ran Harrow Creek's most reliable gossip exchange out of her Tuesday sewing circle, reported to anyone who would listen that Margaret Ellison had lost her grip on good sense. Bless her heart, which was the particular Harrow Creek formulation that meant I am judging you and pretending otherwise. One afternoon in early May, Margaret was outside the barn, checking on an equipment issue when James Pruitt, who ran the feed store and had never in her memory said a kind word to anyone, stopped his wagon on the road and called out. "How's the rot business, Mrs. Ellison?" "Progressing," Margaret said. She did not look up from what she was doing. Progressing toward what, exactly? He was grinning. She could hear it. "Toward being finished," she said. "Have a good afternoon, Mr. Pruitt." He drove on. She heard him laughing when he was far enough away that he thought she couldn't. She went inside and wrote it down, not out of bitterness. She had made a decision early in this enterprise that bitterness was a luxury she could not afford. She wrote it down because she had decided that the gap between what this town expected of her and what she was going to deliver needed to be precisely documented. She wanted to know, when the time came, exactly how wide that gap was. Exactly how wrong they had been. Exactly how far she had come from the woman they had already decided she was. In June, her neighbor Dorothy Crane came to the fence line, while Margaret was checking the eastern post, the one that had been leaning since April, and had finally given up entirely in a May windstorm. Leaving a gap, she had repaired herself with salvaged timber and more rope than was probably structurally ideal. Dorothy was a decent woman, the kind who meant well and expressed it clumsily. "Margaret," she said, with the careful tone of someone about to offer something that might not be welcome. "My cousin has a position open. In Rochester, housekeeper for a good family, steady wages." "I could have thank you, Dorothy," Margaret said. She straightened up from the fence post and looked at her neighbor directly. "I genuinely do. But I'm not leaving." Dorothy's expression carried everything her words didn't: the worry, the pity, the particular helplessness of watching someone you like make what appears to be a very long, slow mistake. "The bank, Margaret, I know about the bank." Margaret's voice was even. "I count the debt every morning before the sun comes up. I know exactly what I'm working against, but I'm working." Dorothy looked at the barn. She looked at Margaret. She looked like she wanted to say more and had the good grace to decide against it. "I'll pray for you," she said. "I'll take it," Margaret said. Dorothy went back across the fence line, and Margaret went back to the barn, and that evening she wrote in the ledger, "Dorothy Crane came today. She means well. She does not believe this will work. She is not going to be right." By August, the smell was changing. The rank sour rot that had cleared Caldwell's dock was gradually becoming something sharper, cleaner, more purposeful. It still wasn't a smell you would call pleasant, but it was a completely different smell, and Margaret knew the difference mattered. She climbed to the barn loft on an August morning with the small spoon she kept in her apron pocket, sampled from 3 barrels, held each sample up to the light coming through the hatch, and tasted carefully. She had to sit down, not because something was wrong. Because it was working, 35 barrels at minimum. Moving cleanly, developing into something that wasn't just serviceable, it was good. Better than she had expected. Better, if she was honest with herself, than she had let herself hope for, because hoping too hard for a specific outcome was a way of setting yourself up for a fall, and she had been falling for 2 years and was tired of the landing. But this was real. She pressed her hand against her chest and sat on the barrel and thought about Ruth in the Pennsylvania cellar with the lantern. Sour isn't ruin, child. Sour is the beginning of something else. "You were right, Grandma," Margaret said to the empty loft. "You were right about all of it." She sat there for a while, letting herself feel what she had not let herself feel in 2 years. Then she picked up her spoon and her ledger and got back to work. But success was not done testing her. 3 weeks into September, she climbed to the loft for her regular check and stopped cold. Barrel 22. Barrel 31. She could tell from 6 feet away. She uncorked both, sampled both, and knew within seconds. Gone. Not the barrels she had already flagged as uncertain, those she had been watching, those she had expected to lose. These were 2 she had believed were progressing correctly, 2 she had been confident in, 2 she had documented as stable and developing as recently as the week before. She stood between them for a long time. The town's voices came without invitation, the way they always did when things went wrong. Too heavy, too alone, too foolish to know what she didn't know. She let them talk. Then she opened the ledger, wrote down the barrel numbers, the date, the observations, and her best analysis of exactly what had gone wrong and why: the position, the cold morning air pooling at that corner of the loft, the thing she had missed. She wrote it all down. She closed the ledger, and then she heard the sound of a wagon coming fast up the road toward her property. Too fast for a social call, the particular speed of someone carrying news. She came down from the loft and walked to the barn door and shaded her eyes against the September afternoon light. It was young Billy Marsh from the telegraph office, standing up in his wagon seat before he had even fully stopped. "Mrs. Ellison," he called out, his voice cracking with the urgency of someone who has been entrusted with information that is too large for him to hold quietly. "Mrs. Ellison, you hear about Whitfield Supply?" She had not heard about Whitfield Supply. "Their warehouse," Billy said, half out of breath, half electric with the drama of it. "Burned down last night. The whole thing. Every barrel they had stored for harvest season gone. All of it." Margaret stood very still. Whitfield Supply was the largest vinegar producer in the county. The company that supplied nearly every merchant, every kitchen, every household within 30 miles of Harrow Creek. "Gone," she repeated. "Every drop," Billy confirmed. "And harvest coming in 6 weeks. Every merchant in the county is going to be looking for supply." He paused, then added, with the dawning arithmetic of a 15-year-old, who was smarter than he usually let on, "You got a lot of barrels in that barn, Mrs. Ellison." Margaret looked back at the barn. She thought about 33 barrels of developing vinegar. She thought about $63.40. She thought about Warren Caldwell's face when he had handed her 3 coins and called it a fair price for something worthless. She turned back to Billy Marsh. "Thank you, Billy," she said. Her voice was completely steady. "You ride safe going back." He tipped his hat and drove away. Margaret stood in the September afternoon and felt the world rearranging itself around her, with a slow, deliberate certainty that she recognized from somewhere deep and old inside herself, the feeling her grandmother had described once. The feeling of a thing that has been patient for a very long time, finally arriving at its moment. She went back inside the barn. She climbed back up to the loft. She uncorked barrel 23, sampled it, studied the color, tasted it twice. Then she picked up her ledger, opened to a clean page, and wrote at the top, "September 18, 1856. Whitfield Supply Warehouse destroyed by fire. Harvest season in 6 weeks. 33 barrels confirmed viable. Product quality exceptional." She underlined the last word. Then she wrote one more line underneath it. "They are going to come to me." She had not slept the night after Billy Marsh drove away. Not because she was afraid. Fear was something she had learned to work with. The way you learn to work with a bad knee or a stubborn mule, you acknowledged it. You made your adjustments, and you kept moving. What kept her awake that night was something closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of something vast and finally understanding how far the ground dropped away on the other side. 33 barrels, Whitfield Supply gone. Harvest in 6 weeks. She lay in the dark and ran the numbers until she knew them, the way she knew her own name, and then she got up and wrote them in the ledger by candlelight, because she didn't trust memory with something this important. If she priced the vinegar at the going market rate, not a penny above, not a penny below 33 barrels would yield enough to pay the bank debt in full, repair the eastern fence line properly, replace the cracked window glass, put 3 months of operating money in the tin, and still have something left over. Something left over. She pressed her hand flat against the ledger page and sat with that for a long time. Then she closed the book, went back to bed, and this time she slept. But the morning brought her back to earth fast. She was in the barn at first light, doing her daily check when she heard the wagon come up the road and knew before she even turned around that it wasn't going to be good news. There was a particular quality to the sound of someone arriving with the intention of making your morning harder, a purposeful rhythm that she had come to recognize the way animals recognized weather before it arrived. It was Franklin Deer. Franklin was a lawyer in Harrow Creek, the only one, and he worked for the bank. Not officially. Officially, he had his own practice. But in the way that small towns had of organizing themselves, so that power stayed with power, Franklin Deer and First Mercantile Bank operated as a single organism. And when one moved, the other was never far behind. He climbed down from his wagon with his hat already in his hands, which was either courtesy or strategy, and she couldn't tell which yet. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, "I apologize for the early hour." "Mr. Deer." She came out of the barn and stood in the yard with her hands at her sides. "What can I do for you? I'm here on behalf of First Mercantile, he said. Mr. Hargrove asked me to come out personally, as a courtesy, before he paused, and the pause was doing a great deal of work. Before he takes further steps. My payment isn't due for 6 weeks, Margaret said. That's correct, however. Franklin turned his hat in his hand slowly, and she noticed that he didn't quite meet her eyes. The bank has become aware that you've been operating a commercial enterprise on this property, the vinegar production, without having disclosed this to the bank as required under the terms of your loan agreement. Any commercial activity on a mortgaged property requires prior notification and approval. The yard went very quiet. Margaret's breath stayed even because she made it stay even. I was not aware of that requirement, she said. It's in the document you signed, Franklin said. And his voice had the quality of a man who is not entirely comfortable with what he's been sent to say, but is going to say it anyway because he has calculated that his discomfort matters less than his paycheck. Mr. Hargrove isn't looking to cause difficulty. He's simply asking that you come into the bank at your earliest convenience to discuss the situation. And if I don't? Franklin put his hat back on his head, which was apparently the signal that the courtesy portion of the visit had concluded. Then he'll have to consider whether the loan terms have been violated in a way that requires him to accelerate the repayment schedule. Accelerate, Margaret repeated. The full balance due within 30 days rather than the original timeline. She looked at him. He looked somewhere in the general direction of her left shoulder. I'll be in on Friday, she said. That would be fine, he said. Good morning, Mrs. Ellison. He drove away. Margaret stood in the yard until she couldn't hear the wagon anymore. Then she walked back into the barn, sat down on an overturned crate, pressed both hands over her face, and breathed. $63 in 30 days instead of 6 weeks. Without the vinegar sales, she had $11. With the vinegar, if she could sell it, if the buyers came, if everything that needed to work did work, she had the full amount and more. But 6 weeks of selling time had just become 30 days of panic, and the only thing standing between her and the loss of the farm was a barn full of vinegar that the town of Harrow Creek had spent 6 months laughing at. She took her hands away from her face. She picked up her ledger. She went back to work. She needed to move faster. That was the simple, brutal truth of the new situation. The timetable had been cut, and she couldn't afford to wait for buyers to find her. She needed to go to them. That same afternoon, she drove back into Harrow Creek and began making calls on every merchant she could reach before the light failed. The first stop was Patterson's Dry Goods, where Gerald Patterson received her with the pleasant, non-committal expression of a man who is willing to listen to almost anything, as long as it doesn't cost him anything. Vinegar, he said, turning the word over as if he hadn't heard it before. Apple cider vinegar, Margaret said, developed from a traditional method. The quality is exceptional. I can bring you a sample this afternoon if you want to taste it before we talk numbers. Gerald looked at her over his counter with the particular expression of a man running a private calculation. She could see what he was calculating. She was a widow. She was large. She had spent 6 months doing something the town had written off as foolishness. He was deciding whether doing business with her would make him look sensible or simply strange. I heard about your experiment, he said, choosing the word with care. It isn't an experiment anymore, Margaret said. It's a product. And with Whitfield's supply out of the market, you're going to need vinegar from somewhere. I'm offering it to you at fair market rate, same quality, delivered to your door. Gerald was quiet. Bring the sample, he said finally. That was the first crack in the wall. She brought him the sample that evening, a small jar, clean and sharp, exactly what she had said it was. He tasted it twice, held it up to his lamp, tasted it a third time. That's good, he said with the reluctant surprise of a man who had not expected to be impressed. Yes, Margaret said, it is. He bought 4 barrels. 4 barrels was not enough to save the farm. But 4 barrels was a beginning, and beginnings were something Margaret had learned to treat with reverence. Because every solid thing she had ever seen in her life had started as something small that most people hadn't bothered to take seriously. She wrote the sale in the ledger that night. She underlined it. The next morning she was back at it, the feed store, the hotel kitchen, 2 of the 3 restaurants on Main Street. Every conversation had the same shape, the polite skepticism. The sample, the reluctant admission that the product was what she said it was, the cautious purchase. Not large amounts, not yet, but each one a brick being laid. And then she walked into Caldwell's trading post. She had not planned to come here. She had a list and Caldwell was not on it. Partly because she assumed he would be the hardest sell, and partly because there was something complicated about standing in front of the man who had paid her $3 for the problem that had become her salvation and asking him to give her more money for it. But his was the largest commercial operation in Harrow Creek, and she had run out of time for strategy. The bell above the door announced her, and Caldwell looked up from behind his counter and went very still. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. "Mr. Caldwell." She put the sample jar on the counter between them. "I have vinegar to sell, 30 barrels at market rate. I understand you're going to need supply before harvest is done, and I'm in a position to give it to you." He looked at the jar for a long moment. "That's made from my cider," he said. "It is," Margaret said. "Your ruined cider that I paid $3 to haul away, that I spent 6 months converting." She kept her voice even. "Which makes it mine, and I'm offering to sell it back to your market at a fair price." Something moved across his face. She couldn't name it precisely, but it wasn't the complacency she had grown used to seeing there. It was something more complicated than that, something that had awareness in it. "Let me taste it," he said. She uncorked the jar. He poured a small amount onto a tasting spoon, the kind he kept behind the counter for sampling products, and tasted it the way a man who actually knew his trade tasted things, slowly, with attention. "How many barrels?" he said. 30. The other 3 are already spoken for." He looked at her for a long time. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I'd like an honest answer. All right, did you know when you took those barrels off my dock that you were going to do this? Or did you figure it out afterward?" Margaret considered the question seriously, because it deserved to be considered seriously. "I knew it was possible," she said. "I wasn't certain it would work. I knew what I was going to try, and you didn't tell me that." "You didn't ask me," she said. "You told me they were worthless." "I didn't agree with you, but you didn't ask my opinion." The store was quiet. Behind Caldwell, a shelf of goods sat neatly organized, less of a man who ran his business carefully and knew what he was doing in the world he understood. She watched him absorb what she had said, watched him locate himself in the story she was telling, find his position in it, and understand what that position looked like from the outside. "What's your price?" She named it. He didn't argue. They shook hands. She was at the door when he said, "Mrs. Ellison." She turned. He was still standing behind the counter, and he had the look of a man who was about to say something he hadn't planned to say. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for how I spoke to you on the dock. The way I looked at you," he paused. "I made assumptions about what you were capable of. They were wrong." Margaret stood in the doorway. She had imagined, in the early weeks, what it would feel like when this town came around. She had imagined it would feel like winning. What it actually felt like was something quieter than that, the particular satisfaction of a thing being made right that never should have been wrong in the first place. "I accept that, Mr. Caldwell," she said. She walked out into the afternoon and took one long breath of clean air. That was the moment the town started changing. Not all at once. Small towns never changed all at once. They changed the way water wore down stone, gradually and without announcement. But Caldwell's purchase spread through Harrow Creek the way everything spread through Harrow Creek, and the story that spread this time was different from the one that had been traveling for 6 months. Margaret heard it third hand from Dorothy Crane, who came to the fence line 2 days later with an expression that was trying to look casual and wasn't managing it. People are saying Caldwell bought 30 barrels from you, Dorothy said. He bought 28, Margaret said, correcting the number without elaborating. The rest are already sold. Dorothy stared at her. All of them? She said, all of them. Dorothy's mouth opened and closed once. Then she said very quietly, the bank deadline is going to be met, Margaret said, with room to spare. The silence between them held the weight of everything Dorothy had been certain of for 6 months, the concern, the pity, the steady quiet certainty that this was going to end badly, and the simultaneous collapse of all of it. Margaret, Dorothy said, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Margaret told her. Come for coffee on Sunday if you want. Bring your sewing. Dorothy nodded, somewhat dazed, and went back across the fence line. But the story wasn't done arranging its complications. The morning after the Caldwell deal, Margaret arrived at the barn for her regular check and knew immediately that something was wrong. The door was slightly open. She had latched it herself the night before. She latched it every night. It was habit, reflex, the kind of thing she did without thinking, because the barn door open in the morning meant the hens got in, and the hens meant disorder, and disorder was something she could not afford. She pushed the door open slowly. At first she couldn't see what had changed. Everything looked the way it should look: the barrels in their positions, the ropes, the ledger on its shelf, the morning light coming through the east gap the same way it always came through. Then she saw barrel 17. Someone had been at it. The cork was not seated the way she left corks. She had a particular way of pressing them, flush and firm, and this one was canted at an angle that told her it had been removed and replaced by someone else's hands. There was a small dark stain on the floor beside it, a spill that had not been there the night before. She stood very still. Then she checked barrel 20. Same thing. And barrel 24. 3 barrels interfered with. She uncorked each one carefully and sampled. 2 were fine. Whoever had been in here hadn't been in long enough or known enough to do real damage. But barrel 24 had a smell beneath the clean vinegar note that she recognized immediately, and with a cold, dropping sensation in her chest. Contaminated. She didn't know with what. It could be a dozen things: the wrong substance introduced, the culture disturbed, a foreign element added deliberately or accidentally. She wouldn't know without time and analysis she didn't have. What she knew was that one of her 30 barrels, one of the barrels she had already sold, was no longer what she had promised it was. She stood in the barn with her hand on barrel 24 and felt the cold work its way from her chest outward. Someone had been in here. Someone from this town had come onto her property in the night and put their hands on what she had built. She thought about who might do it. She thought about why. She thought about Holt and his dockside laughter, about Pruitt and his mocking call from the road, about the 6 months of the fool with 40 rotten barrels, and what that kind of contempt looked like when it converted into action. But she didn't have time for anger. Anger was another luxury she couldn't afford. She had a contaminated barrel and a sale to honor and a bank deadline in less than 30 days. She opened the ledger and wrote, morning of October 2. Barn door found open. 3 barrels disturbed. Barrel 24 contaminated, nature unknown, source unknown. Sale to Caldwell does not include barrel 24. Replacement must be sourced, or that position in the order must be adjusted. Then she wrote something else underneath it, in larger letters than she usually wrote. This changes nothing. She carried barrel 24 out of the barn herself, set it aside from the others, and went back inside to begin the morning's proper work. She needed a 24th barrel, and she had an idea about where to get one. Agatha Whitmore had mentioned, the first day they spoke, that she kept a small personal stock of vinegar on her own property, not for sale, but produced over the years from her own orchard surplus. Quality she knew was reliable, from a source she trusted completely. Margaret drove out that afternoon. Agatha came to the door and looked at her and said, before Margaret had spoken a word, something happened. Someone got into my barn, Margaret said. 1 barrel is compromised. I need a replacement to honor a sale I've already made. I'll pay you fair market rate or barter, whatever you want." Agatha was quiet for a moment. "Come in," she said. They sat at the kitchen table, and Margaret described what she had found, clearly and without embellishment, the way she tried to do everything now clearly and without embellishment. Because she had found that clarity was a form of strength and embellishment was a form of fear. Agatha listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished, Agatha said, "Do you know who did it?" "Not with certainty. But you have a feeling." "I have a feeling," Margaret said. Agatha nodded slowly. "People don't like to be wrong about someone," she said. "Especially not someone they decided early on wasn't worth much. When you prove them wrong, it makes something was then taken from them." She paused. "That's their problem, not yours. It became my problem when they opened my barn door," Margaret said. "Fair enough," Agatha said. "I have 8 barrels. I'll give you 1 at market rate. You can pay me when Caldwell pays you." She stood up. "And Margaret, yes? Keep a better lock on that barn door." Margaret almost smiled. "I'm having one fitted tomorrow morning." She drove home with the replacement barrel in her wagon, the cold October air against her face, and thought about what Agatha had said. They don't like to be wrong about someone. She turned that over for the length of the drive, examining it from different angles because she thought it was true, but she also thought it was incomplete. It wasn't just that they didn't like to be wrong. It was that they had built something on being right about her, a whole architecture of assumption, a comfortable certainty that she would fail and confirm what they already believed about women like her, about widows with debt and barns full of bad ideas. And she was in the process of kicking that architecture over. And some people, when their architecture fell, looked for someone to blame for the falling. She wasn't going to let that be her problem, but she was going to document it. She added 3 pages to the ledger that night. Everything she had observed, every detail of the 3 disturbed barrels, the specific way barrel 24 had been compromised. She dated and signed each page. Then she put the ledger in the tin with the money, under the kitchen floorboard, and pressed the boards back into place. Evidence, she thought, just in case. The next morning she drove to the bank. Franklin Deere was in the lobby when she arrived and went visibly still, which told her he had not expected to see her this early in the process. That was useful information. Edgar Hargrove, the bank manager, received her in his office with the careful civility of a man who understood that the person across the desk from him had more information than he did and was waiting to find out exactly how much more. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, "I understand you've been quite busy." "I have," Margaret said. She opened the ledger on his desk and turned it so he could read it. "I've listed here the current sales, the confirmed buyers, the delivery timeline, and the payment dates. As you can see, the full balance due to this bank will be in your hands before the 30-day accelerated deadline." With 6 days to spare, Hargrove looked at the ledger. He looked at it for a long time. This as he stopped. Started again. "These numbers are from Warren Caldwell's operation?" "Among others, Gerald, the hotel, Marsh Restaurant." She turned a page. "I can provide written confirmation from each buyer if you require it." Hargrove sat back in his chair. "That won't be necessary," he said. Something had changed in his expression. The careful civility was still there, but underneath it now was something different. Something that looked almost like respect, though it was the kind of respect that came with the slight embarrassment of a man who realizes he has been operating on incorrect assumptions and prefers not to acknowledge this directly. The loan terms matter. The commercial activity disclosure requirement. "I'd like to discuss that," Margaret said pleasantly. "Specifically, I'd like to understand exactly where in the loan document that requirement appears. I've read the document several times and I'd like your help locating the precise language." The silence in the office was very specific. "We can review it together," Hargrove said slowly. "I'd appreciate that," Margaret said. They reviewed it together for 35 minutes. At the end of 35 minutes, Hargrove told her that the bank would be confirming the original repayment timeline was in effect, with no acceleration. "Thank you," Margaret said, and closed her ledger, and stood up and shook his hand. She walked out of the bank into the October morning and stood on the front step and took a breath so deep it made her ribs expand. The debt was not gone yet, but the threat was. And the difference between those two things was the difference between drowning and treading water. She was still in the water, but she could breathe, and she knew which direction was shore. She was 3 steps down the bank steps when she heard her name. She turned. Holt was crossing the street toward her. Not the Doc Holt, not the grinning, muttering Holt of 7 months ago. This Holt was moving with the deliberate, slightly uncomfortable gait of someone who has decided to do something and is committed to seeing it through before his nerve fails him. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. He stopped a few feet from her, and he didn't look quite at her, not quite meeting her eyes, not quite looking away. "I heard about the barn," she waited. "About somebody getting in at night," he said. "Messing with your barrels." He shifted his weight. "That wasn't." He stopped, started again. "I want you to know I had no part in that." Margaret looked at him. "I believe you," she said. And she did not because she trusted him entirely, but because she had observed enough of Holt over 7 months to understand that his cruelty was the lazy, public kind, the kind that needed an audience and daylight. What had happened in her barn was something different. Smaller, more private, and therefore more deliberate. "The things I said," Holt continued. "What I called you." At the dock and after, he was looking at his boots now. "That wasn't I shouldn't have." "No," Margaret said. "You shouldn't have." He nodded just once, a short jerking motion. "I'm sorry, ma'am." She looked at him for a moment, really looked at the discomfort and the effort and the genuine, clumsy sincerity of it, and decided that an apology offered awkwardly and honestly was worth more than one delivered smoothly and strategically. "Apology accepted, Mr. Holt," she said. She continued down the steps and turned toward her wagon. Behind her, she heard him exhale slowly, the sound of a man releasing something he had been carrying longer than was comfortable. She did not look back. She had things to do, 3 barrels left to deliver. A lock to have fitted on the barn door. A fence post on the north edge that had started showing the same lean as the one on the east. And she had learned by now that a leaning post, left alone, became a fallen post, and a fallen post became a gap, and a gap in a fence was a story that always ended badly. She had a farm to run. She had a debt to pay. She had a business, a real business, her own, built from $3 and 6 months of work that the world had told her was foolishness, and it needed tending the same way everything she had ever cared about needed tending. But as she drove out of Harrow Creek that afternoon with the October light angling low and gold across the road, something made her slow Clover to a walk and look back at the town behind her. She had arrived in Harrow Creek as Thomas Ellison's wife. She had stayed in Harrow Creek as Thomas Ellison's widow. And she was leaving town today as Margaret Ellison, vinegar producer, farm owner, a woman who had walked into a bank with a ledger and walked out with her land still under her feet. She turned back to the road. Somewhere in the remaining barrels, still sitting in her barn, there was a number she had not yet addressed, barrel 31, one of the ones she had flagged in September. The one she hadn't opened yet, because she had been managing the crisis of barrel 24 and the bank meeting and the deliveries, and she needed to know its status before she could close the accounts on this whole enterprise. She had been avoiding it, not consciously, but she had been avoiding it. Because barrel 31 was one she had had the highest hopes for, early in the process placed in the best position in the barn, given the most careful attention, the one she had privately thought of as her finest work. And in September, when she had flagged it, she had not been able to determine whether the problem she saw was real or whether she was second-guessing herself after the contamination scare. She would know tomorrow, and something in the quality of the afternoon, the low gold light, and the way the road ahead of her was clear and straight all the way to the farm, told her that the answer was going to matter. Not for the money. The money was handled. For something else. Something she hadn't named yet. Clover moved steadily along the road, patient and reliable as she had always been, and Margaret let the reins rest easy in her hands and let herself feel, very carefully, the thing she had not let herself feel for 6 months. She thought the barrel was going to be fine. She thought it was all going to be fine. But she had also been wrong before, and in the morning she was going to find out which one of those things was true. Barrel 31 was fine, better than fine. Margaret uncorked it the next morning with her hands steady and her heart doing something complicated in her chest. And the smell that rose up was clean and sharp and exactly right, the kind of vinegar that made you blink. Not because it was harsh, but because it was precise, a clarity that told you immediately it had been made correctly from the beginning to the end. She tasted it twice. Then she sat down on the crate she kept in the barn for exactly this kind of moment, the moments that required sitting and pressed both hands over her face and breathed. 33 barrels, all accounted for, all delivered or scheduled for delivery. The contaminated barrel replaced with Agatha's stock, the Caldwell order complete, the smaller accounts settled, the ledger balanced in a way it had not been balanced since Thomas died. She was going to be all right. She sat with that for a long time, because she had spent 6 months not letting herself believe it, and the believing needed space to settle into something real before she could stand up and move forward. Then she stood up and moved forward. The first payment to the bank came in on the 14th of October, Caldwell's account, which settled the largest portion of the debt in a single transaction. Margaret stood at the bank counter and watched Edgar Hargrove record the amount in his ledger with a pen that scratched quietly against the paper, and she felt each scratch like something being released from her chest. "That leaves $18.40, Hargrove said. "I have a delivery scheduled for next Tuesday. That will cover 12 of it," Margaret said. "The remainder by the end of the month." Hargrove nodded. He had developed, in the weeks since their meeting in his office, a new manner with her, still formal, still contained, but without the particular quality of condescension that had flavored everything before. He looked at her now, the way he looked at Caldwell and Patterson, which was to say he looked at her like someone whose numbers he respected. It wasn't warmth, but it was something she could work with. "Very good, Mrs. Ellison," he said. She walked out of the bank and directly into trouble. James Pruitt was standing on the front step of his feeds store across the street, and he was not alone. He was talking to a man Margaret didn't recognize, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that was too good for Harrow Creek, and a hat pulled low enough that she couldn't see his face clearly from this distance. What she could see was that Pruitt was pointing at her. She kept walking toward her wagon. She did not look back. She had a rule about not looking back, and she intended to keep it. But that night, after she had eaten and updated the ledger and banked the kitchen fire, she lay in the dark, thinking about the stranger in the good coat. And something in the back of her mind, the part that had learned over 6 months to notice things and write them down, said quietly and distinctly that she should have looked. She found out who he was 3 days later. His name was Cornelius Vance, and he was a regional distributor out of Albany, who had been traveling through the area picking up supply in the wake of the Whitfield fire. This information came to her from Dorothy Crane, who had gotten it from Mrs. Eleanor Harker, who had gotten it from the hotel desk clerk, which was about as reliable a chain of information as Harrow Creek produced. "He's been talking to merchants all week," Dorothy said at the fence line. "Buying up vinegar stock from anyone who has it. Some people are saying he's representing a company that wants to lock down the regional supply before winter." "How much is he paying?" Margaret asked. Dorothy looked at her. "More than market rate, from what I'm hearing. Significantly more." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Has he come to see me?" she asked. "Not yet," Dorothy said. "But Margaret Pruitt told him about you." "About the barrels. What did he tell him?" Dorothy's expression did the complicated thing it did when she had information she wasn't sure how to deliver. "He told him you got lucky, that you had help, that the operation was a..." She stopped. "Say it," Margaret said. A fluke, Dorothy said quietly. He told him it was a fluke and that the product was probably inconsistent. The morning was very still. Margaret looked at the fence post on the north edge of the property, the one that had started leaning. She had been meaning to fix it for 2 weeks and had not gotten to it yet, and looking at it now, she thought that a leaning post left alone always became the same thing eventually. "Thank you for telling me, Dorothy," she said. She fixed the fence post that afternoon. And she waited. Cornelius Vance came to her farm on a Friday morning, 3 days after Dorothy's warning, and he arrived the way people arrived when they wanted you to understand that they were significant in a good carriage, well-dressed, unhurried, with the ease of a man who had never once in his life needed to convince himself he deserved to take up space. He was perhaps 45, with a broad, pleasant face and very attentive eyes that moved around her property. With a professional efficiency, she recognized the gaze of someone assessing value, cataloging what was there, what was missing, what could be used. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, removing his hat, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "You're not," Margaret said. She was standing in the yard, and she did not invite him to step closer. "What can I do for you, Mr. Vance?" He introduced himself, the Albany connection, the distribution company, the regional purchasing trip. He explained it all smoothly, the way a man explained things who had explained them many times before, and had refined the explanation to its most efficient form. "I've been hearing about your vinegar operation," he said. "From several sources in town. The quality, the volume, the timeline you managed it in." He paused, and she noticed the pause was calibrated just long enough to suggest he was considering whether to say the next thing, though she was certain he had decided to say it before he arrived. "I'd like to make you an offer. For the remaining stock?" Margaret said. "I'm afraid I don't have remaining stock. The season's production is sold." Vance smiled. It was a good smile, practiced and warm at exactly the right temperature. "Not for remaining stock," he said. "For next season's production. And the season after that." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "I'd like to offer you a supply contract. Guaranteed purchase at a fixed rate for 2 years, with an option to extend. You produce, we purchase. No market uncertainty, no individual merchant negotiation. You'd know your income before you started each season." Margaret looked at the document without taking it. "What's the rate?" she asked. He named it. It was below market rate. Not dramatically below, not enough below to be insulting, just enough below to be profitable for him, and just enough above nothing to sound, to someone who had been struggling for 2 years, like security. She understood it immediately. This was the offer you made to someone who was afraid. Someone who would look at a guaranteed number and feel the fear drain out of them and reach for certainty the way a drowning person reached for a rope, without looking too closely at what the rope was attached to. She was not afraid. Not anymore. "That rate is 14% below current market," she said. Vance's smile didn't move. "There's value in certainty," he said. "The market fluctuates. A contract removes that risk." "It removes my risk of a good year and protects your risk of a bad one," Margaret said. "That's not the same as removing risk. That's transferring it." Something shifted behind his pleasant eyes. A very slight recalibration, the adjustment of a man who has discovered that the person across from him is more specific than he expected. "You've done very well this season," he said. "But one season isn't a pattern. Markets change. Supply recovers. The Whitfield fire was unusual. That kind of disruption won't happen every year." "You're right," Margaret said. "It won't. Which means I need to be prepared to sell on quality rather than scarcity. And my quality is exceptional." She paused. "You tasted it before you came here, Mr. Vance. Someone in town gave you a sample, I can tell by the way you're standing there. You already know what the product is." The smile became something more genuine, for just a moment the involuntary response of a man who has been accurately read. "It's very good," he admitted. "Yes," Margaret said. "It is, and I'll sell it at market rate to buyers who value it, rather than below market to a contract that values me less than my product is worth. Vance looked at her for a long moment. "The offer is on the table if you change your mind," he said. "I appreciate that," she said. He put his hat back on, nodded once, and walked back to his carriage. She watched him go. And then, because she was the kind of woman who documented things, she went inside and wrote down every word of the conversation while it was still fresh. She had barely finished writing when she heard the second wagon. This one came faster than Vance's carriage. This one came with the particular urgency that Billy Marsh's wagon had carried, the day he told her about the Whitfield fire, the speed of news that couldn't wait to arrive. But it wasn't Billy this time. It was Dorothy Crane, and Dorothy's face was the color of a woman who has been running in cold air, and she was down from her wagon before it had fully stopped. "Margaret," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need to tell you before you hear it from someone else." The yard went quiet in that particular way. It went quiet when something was about to change. "Tell me," Margaret said. Dorothy pressed her hands together. "Franklin Dear has been talking to Vance. Before Vance came here. They had a meeting at the hotel yesterday evening, and someone from the hotel told someone who told she stopped, collected herself. Franklin told Vance that your loan with the bank has a clause that gives the bank a right of first claim on commercial proceeds from the property. If it's in the document, Margaret, it means the bank could argue that your vinegar revenue technically passes through them before it gets to you. And Vance would use that to renegotiate his offer," Margaret finished. Dorothy stared. "You knew?" "I didn't know about the conversation," Margaret said. "But I know how this kind of pressure works." She was already moving toward the house. "Dorothy, I need to look at something. Come inside." She had read the loan document twice before. She had read it a third time after Franklin Dear's early morning visit in October. She pulled it out now from the tin under the floorboard and read it a fourth time, standing at the kitchen table with Dorothy across from her, and the October light flat and clear through the window. She read the entire document. Then she read the clause Franklin Dear had apparently been citing. Then she set the document down very carefully on the table and looked at Dorothy. "It doesn't say that," she said. Dorothy blinked. "What?" "The clause he's citing. It applies to proceeds from the sale of mortgaged property, meaning if I sold the farm itself, the bank gets paid first. It doesn't apply to revenue generated by a business operating on the property." She turned the document around so Dorothy could see the page. "Read the third paragraph of Section 4. Dorothy read it. Her lips moved slightly. When she looked up, her expression had gone from frightened to something more complicated. "He's misrepresenting it," Dorothy said. "He's counting on me not having read it carefully enough to know the difference," Margaret said. She was not angry. She was something much colder than angry. She was certain. She folded the loan document, put it in the pocket of her dress, and went to hitch Clover. "Where are you going?" Dorothy asked. "To see Franklin Dear," Margaret said. "And then to see Edgar Hargrove. Margaret, maybe you should wait." "I've been waiting for 2 years," Margaret said, and her voice was so even and so quiet that Dorothy stopped talking. "I'm done waiting." She drove into town in 20 minutes and went directly to Franklin Dear's office, which occupied the front room of a building near the courthouse. Franklin was at his desk when she walked in unannounced, and he looked up with the expression of a man whose morning has just become significantly more complicated than he had planned for. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. "I wasn't expecting. I know you weren't," she said. She put the loan document on his desk and opened it to Section 4. "I'd like you to read the third paragraph and tell me what it says." The silence in the office was very precise. Franklin looked at the document. He looked at it for longer than it took to read 3 paragraphs, which told her everything she needed to know about what was happening behind his expression. "I may have been hasty in my interpretation," he said finally. "You told Cornelius Vance that the bank has a claim on my commercial revenue," Margaret said. "That isn't what this document says. You know, it isn't what this document says." "And you told him anyway." Franklin adjusted his pen on the desk. He adjusted it again. There's room for interpretation in legal language. There isn't room in this language, Margaret said. I've read it 4 times. She reached across the desk and turned the document back toward herself and folded it. I'm going to see Mr. Hargrove now. I'd like you to come with me and clarify your interpretation directly. Franklin Deere was not a bad man. She was fairly certain of that. The way she was certain of most things she had observed carefully over time, he was a man who made the calculations that men in his position made, who weighed the cost of honesty against the cost of convenience and chose convenience when he thought no one was watching closely enough to see the difference. He had chosen wrong. All right, he said. He came. The meeting with Hargrove lasted 40 minutes. Franklin was precise and uncomfortable and accurate in a way that suggested he had decided overnight that his association with Vance's strategy was more of a liability than an asset, which meant he had either developed a conscience or done the arithmetic and found the same result. Either way, he clarified the clause correctly, in front of Hargrove and in front of Margaret. And Hargrove listened with the expression of a man who was receiving information he suspected he should have known and was deciding how to incorporate it without admitting he hadn't. When Franklin finished, Hargrove looked at Margaret. The bank has no claim on your commercial revenue, he said. The loan terms are clear. I apologize if there was any confusion. Thank you, Margaret said. She walked out of the bank for the second time in 2 weeks, feeling like the ground was more solid under her feet than it had been when she walked in. Not because something good had happened, exactly something bad had been stopped, which was a different thing. But she was learning that stopping bad things was its own kind of progress, and progress was progress regardless of its shape. She was at the bottom of the bank steps when she heard the voice. You went in there alone, she turned. It was Caldwell. He was standing across the street, and he had clearly been there long enough to have seen her arrive and seen Franklin Deere accompany her inside. Because his expression was not surprise, it was something more like a man watching a scene unfold that he had expected to unfold differently. I had something to resolve, she said. He crossed the street toward her. He moved with a deliberateness that was new, not the confident ease of a man who owned the ground he walked on, but something more careful than that. More considered. Vance came to see me this morning, he said. After he left your property yesterday, he told me he'd made you an offer and you'd turned it down. I did, Margaret said. He also told me Caldwell stopped. Something crossed his face, a conflict she could see clearly, even though he was trying not to let it show. He told me that if I continued purchasing from you directly rather than through his distribution network, he would pull the supply contract he's been negotiating with my trading post for the Albany imports. The street was ordinary around them, wagons moving, people walking, the unremarkable texture of a regular morning in a small town. Inside it, this moment was happening, and Margaret understood exactly what it was. This was the test. Not of Caldwell's loyalty, she had no claim on his loyalty, but of his character, and of what he was going to do with the information she had given him about how the world could work when you paid attention to it. That's a real threat, she said. The Albany supply matters to your business. Yes, Caldwell said, it does. So what are you going to do? He was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about that since 6 this morning, he said. I've been thinking about a woman who paid $3 for something I called worthless and built something that I came to her door to buy back. He paused. I've been thinking about what kind of man uses someone else's vulnerability as a business tool. And, Margaret said, and I'd rather tell Vance to take his contract somewhere else than be the kind of man who does that, Caldwell said. If you'll still sell to me directly next season. She looked at him. She looked at him the way she had learned to look at people, not for what they were presenting, but for what was underneath the presentation, the actual substance of the person showing through the cracks. What she saw was real, not perfect. He was not a perfect man, and he never would be, and she didn't need him to be. But real. The kind of real that came from a person deciding who they were going to be when it cost them something, which was the only decision that actually counted. "I'll sell to you directly," she said. They shook hands. This time his grip was different, not the brief, efficient handshake of a man performing courtesy. Something more like equals meeting in the middle of a road and deciding together which direction to walk. She drove home with the afternoon light already dropping toward the horizon and her mind moving fast through what she knew and what she still needed to figure out. Vance was not done. She understood that clearly. A man who had come this far, who had worked Franklin Deere, and tried to use the bank clause and pressured Caldwell, was not going to retreat after one setback. He was going to look for another angle, and she needed to understand what that angle was before he found it. She was at the farm gate when she saw Agatha's wagon parked in her yard. Her first thought was that something had happened to Agatha, that the old woman had driven 5 miles at this hour for a reason that would not be a good reason. But Agatha was sitting upright on the wagon seat, with her sharp black eyes and her straight back, looking entirely purposeful. "I've been waiting 40 minutes, Agatha said, without preamble. "I was in town," Margaret said. "What happened?" "My neighbor's boy came by this morning. He works for Vance's driver when Vance is in the county, holds the horses, runs errands." Agatha climbed down from the wagon with the deliberate care of a woman who was 71 and had no patience for being helped. "He told me something I think you need to hear." "Tell me," Margaret said. "Vance has been talking to the Henderson farm," Agatha said. "The Hendersons who supplied Caldwell with the bad apple crop last winter. The crop that became your 40 barrels. Margaret's hands went still. "The Henderson farm borders your eastern property line," Agatha continued. "About 4 acres of it." Her voice was precise and unhurried, the voice of a woman who understood that the most important information needed to be delivered without drama, because drama was a distraction, and she had not driven 5 miles for a distraction. "Vance has made an offer on those 4 acres. If he buys them, he controls the water rights on your eastern irrigation channel." The yard was completely quiet. Margaret understood water rights. She had grown up on a farm, and she had been managing this one for 2 years, and she understood exactly what it meant when someone controlled the water that fed your crops. Without the eastern irrigation channel, her apple orchard was not an orchard. It was a field of dying trees, and without the orchard she had no apples. And without apples she had no cider, and without cider that went wrong in exactly the right way, she had no vinegar. The whole enterprise, everything she had built, the debt paid, the business established, the name she had made, from nothing depended on that channel. She stood in her yard in the fading October light and felt the thing she had refused to feel for 6 months. Fear, real fear, not the manageable fear of debt or exhaustion or public mockery. The fear of something that could actually end her, the specific cold weight of a threat that was designed precisely for her, aimed at the exact thing she could not afford to lose. She stood with it. She let it be real. And then she breathed. "When is the sale supposed to close?" she said. "His driver is talking like it's already done," Agatha said. "But the boy said the Henderson family hasn't signed anything yet. The old man Henderson is dragging his feet. He doesn't trust Vance, doesn't like the way he appeared out of nowhere, with a generous offer for 4 specific acres." She paused. "He might be persuadable." "Persuadable to do what?" Margaret said. "To sell to someone else," Agatha said. "Or not to sell at all." Margaret looked at her farm. She looked at the orchard, the apple trees that had budded tentatively in April, and had produced, by October, a modest but genuine crop that she had already planned her next season around. She looked at the fence line that ran along the eastern edge where she had fixed the post and where, just beyond the property boundary, the Henderson land began. 4 acres. She had $11 and some change in the tin under the kitchen floorboard. The bank debt was almost cleared, but not completely cleared, and what remained in the tin was already allocated to the final payment and operating expenses for the winter. She did not have the money to buy 4 acres of land. She turned back to Agatha. "What would it take to get old Henderson to delay the sale?" she said. Agatha's expression was the expression of a woman who had already been thinking about this for the 40 minutes she had spent waiting in the yard. "He doesn't need the money urgently," Agatha said. "He needs to believe the land is going to a use he approves of. He's farming family third generation. He doesn't like the idea of the water rights being used as a commercial weapon. But he doesn't know you well enough to trust you yet." "Who does he trust?" Margaret said. Agatha was quiet for exactly 1 second. "He trusts me," she said. The space between those words and whatever came next was the length of a breath, the space where decisions lived before they became actions. Margaret looked at Agatha Whitmore at her 71 years, and her sharp black eyes and her knowledge, and her 5-mile drive and her 40-minute wait, and the single sentence she had just said with all the weight of a woman who had decided something and was placing it on the table for Margaret to pick up or not. "Would you go to him?" Margaret said. "I already planned to," Agatha said. "Tomorrow morning. But I need to know what I'm offering on your behalf." "I can't buy the land," Margaret said. "Not yet. I don't have what it would take." "Not land," Agatha said, "a promise. A specific, documented promise that the channel will be maintained and available to any neighboring property holder who needs it, in perpetuity, as long as you own this farm. It costs you nothing, and it binds you to something Henderson already believes should be true." She paused. "And it means Vance gets nothing useful, even if he eventually finds another angle." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she went inside and got the ledger. She wrote the promise out in full, clear, specific, legally legible language, the kind she had learned from reading her own loan document 4 times. She signed it. She dated it. She came back out and handed it to Agatha. Agatha read it carefully, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket. "I'll go first thing tomorrow," she said. "Agatha," Margaret said. The old woman looked at her. "Why are you helping me?" Margaret said. Not with suspicion, with genuine wanting to know. The question of a woman who had spent 6 months learning not to assume that kindness was something given for free. Agatha looked at her for a long moment. "Because you reminded me of something," she said. 40 years ago, when I started out alone, there was a woman who drove 5 miles to give me knowledge I couldn't have found anywhere else. She didn't ask me why I thought I deserved it. She just gave it." She paused. "I've been waiting a long time to find somewhere useful to put that." She climbed back onto her wagon. She drove away down the October road. Margaret stood in the yard until she couldn't hear the wheels anymore. Then she went back inside, sat at the kitchen table, and picked up the ledger. She turned to a fresh page. At the top, in her careful, even hand, she wrote, "October 19, 1856. The threat is real. The answer is already in motion. This changes nothing." Then she went to bed, but sleep, which had been more reliable lately, would not come. She lay in the dark and thought about water rights and Henderson land, and Cornelius Vance in his good coat and his carriage. And underneath all of it, she thought about something that had been sitting quietly in the back of her mind since the conversation with Caldwell on the bank steps. He had told her about Vance's threat. He had not needed to. He could have simply pulled his purchase agreement, cited supply difficulties, offered a vague apology, and she would never have known exactly why. Men in Harrow Creek did that kind of thing routinely. They made decisions and cited circumstances and allowed the real reasons to stay politely unexamined. He had told her. He had stood in the street and told her the truth about the pressure he was under and the decision he had made, and she had been so focused on the practical implications, the Vance threat, the Agatha conversation, the water rights, that she had not fully stopped to consider what it meant that he had done that. She lay in the dark thinking about it, and just before sleep finally came, she thought something she had not thought in a very long time. Not a plan, not a number, not a problem to solve, just a quiet, unguarded observation that arrived in the dark, like something that had been standing just outside the door for a while, waiting for her to stop being busy long enough to open it. He is a decent man. She let the thought settle. Then she slept. Agatha came back the next afternoon. Margaret heard the wagon from inside the barn where she was doing her morning inventory, counting what was left, what was owed, what still needed to move before winter made delivery difficult, and she was outside before Agatha had fully stopped. She could read the old woman's face by now. 6 months of careful observation had taught her that Agatha Whitmore's expressions were economical in the extreme. She did not waste her face on things that didn't warrant it. So when Margaret came out of the barn and saw something in Agatha's eyes that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one, she felt the tension in her chest release by exactly 1 degree. "Henderson won't sell to Vance," Agatha said, climbing down. Margaret breathed. "He read your promise document," Agatha continued. "Read it twice. Asked me 3 questions about you: how long I'd known you, whether you kept your word, whether you were the kind of woman who understood what it meant to make a written commitment." She paused. "I told him I'd known you 6 months, and that was long enough." "What did he see to that?" "He said 6 months was enough time to know a horse," Agatha said. "I told him you were considerably more reliable than a horse." She reached into her coat pocket. "He signed this." She held out a folded paper. Margaret took it and opened it carefully. It was a letter, handwritten, in the deliberate print of a man who had learned to write as an adult and never fully trusted cursive. It stated that Elias Henderson had declined the offer made by Cornelius Vance of Albany for the purchase of 4 acres bordering the eastern property line of the Ellison farm, and that his intention was to maintain those acres as agricultural land in keeping with their historical use, and that the water channel running along that boundary was to be considered a shared resource in perpetuity, per the agreement he had reached with Mrs. Margaret Ellison of Harrow Creek. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket, next to the loan document she had been carrying for 3 weeks. "Thank you," she said. And because those 2 words were not enough and she knew it, she added, "I don't know what I would have done without you this year." "You would have figured something out," Agatha said. "You're that kind of woman." "I wasn't sure I was," Margaret said. "In April, when I bought those barrels." Agatha looked at her steadily. "I was," she said. "From the first morning you sat across my kitchen table." She turned back to her wagon. "Make sure that document is somewhere safe. And Margaret Vance isn't finished. Men like that don't accept a closed door. They look for a window." She drove away. Margaret stood in the yard holding the letter and thought about windows. She found the window 2 days later. Though she hadn't been looking for it, it found her. The way threats always seem to find you at exactly the moment you had allowed yourself to feel the most secure. It was Dorothy who brought it. Dorothy, who had become in the past month something closer to a genuine ally than the cautious, well-meaning neighbor she had been for 2 years. Arrived at the fence line on a Tuesday morning, with her face doing the complicated thing that meant difficult information was coming. "Vance filed a complaint with the county assessor," Dorothy said. "Against your operation." Margaret was very still. "What kind of complaint?" "He's claiming that the vinegar production constitutes an unlicensed commercial operation in violation of county agricultural zoning statutes." Dorothy pressed her lips together. "He's asking the assessor to issue a cease order until the matter is reviewed." The orchard was quiet around them. The November air was cold, and the apple trees had gone bare, which gave the party a particular starkness that Margaret usually found honest, and today found simply stark. "A cease order," she said. "It would mean stopping production while the county reviews the complaint. Could take weeks. Could take until spring." Dorothy's voice had the careful evenness of someone delivering bad news while trying not to make it worse by how they delivered it. "If you can't produce this winter, you lose the early season contracts." "And if you lose those, I know what I lose," Margaret said. She knew exactly what she lost. She had spent 6 months building a customer base, a reputation, a reliable name in a county that had decided she was unreliable, and a cease order, even a temporary one, would undo that the way a single frost undid 6 months of careful tending. Buyers who had just found her would find someone else. Buyers who had been cautious about her would feel justified in their caution. The window Agatha had warned her about was not 4 acres of Henderson land. It was her own legitimacy. That was what Vance was going after. Not her water, not her buyers, her name. She turned and went inside the house. She pulled the loan document from her pocket. She pulled Henderson's letter from her other pocket. She opened the ledger to the pages where she had documented the barn break-in. Barrel 24. The contamination, the evidence she had preserved because something had told her to preserve it. She spread everything on the kitchen table and looked at it. Then she did what she had learned to do when the problem in front of her was too large to see all at once. She made a list, not in bullet points, in complete sentences, the way her grandmother had taught her to think, because incomplete sentences left room for incomplete thinking, and incomplete thinking was how careful people made careless mistakes. What Vance had: a complaint filed with an assessor who didn't know her and had no reason to favor her. What she had: 6 months of documented production. Sales receipts, buyer testimony, a signed letter from a neighboring landowner. An old woman with 71 years of knowledge and a precise, reliable memory. And the loan document that proved the bank had co-claim on her commercial revenue, which meant no institutional pressure could be brought to bear from that direction. What she needed: someone who understood county statutes well enough to answer Vance's complaint before the assessor made a decision based only on what Vance had told him. She closed the ledger. She went to Hitchclover. Franklin Deere's office was where she had left it, near the courthouse, and Franklin Deere was at his desk, where he always seemed to be. And he looked up when she walked in with the expression of a man who was becoming accustomed to her arriving, unannounced, and had reached a kind of resigned acceptance of this fact. "Miss Ellison," he said. "Mr. Deere," she said. She put the documents on his desk, the production ledger, the sales records, Henderson's letter, the barn break-in documentation. "I need your help." He looked at the documents. He looked at her. "Vance filed against you," he said. Not a question. He did. Franklin was quiet for a moment. She watched him locate himself in this situation, find his position, understand it. She had watched him do this before, in Hargrove's office, and she knew what it looked like when he was deciding. "The county statutes on agricultural commercial operations are specific," he said slowly. "They apply to operations that process and sell goods produced off-site. Your vinegar is made from apples grown on your property, or was the first season. The mother culture came from Agatha Whitmore's property," Margaret said. "The replacement barrel came from her stock. Vance could argue those are off-site sourced materials." "He will argue that," Franklin said. "It's the only angle that has any traction." He pulled the ledger toward him and opened it. He read for 3 minutes without speaking. Then he turned to the sales records. Then to the barn documentation. Then to Henderson's letter. He closed everything and looked at her. "The replacement barrel," he said. "1 barrel out of 33. And you have documentation showing it was purchased to replace a barrel that was deliberately contaminated by an outside party." "I have documentation showing the barn was entered without permission, and 3 barrels disturbed," she said. "I can't prove deliberate contamination versus accidental, but I have the dates, the evidence, and the record of the damage." "That's enough to make Vance's complaint look like what it is," Franklin said. "Which is a commercial competitor using a regulatory process to harm a legitimate operation." He paused. "I should tell you that helping you means I'm burning whatever relationship I had with Vance's distribution network." "I know that," Margaret said. "I'm telling you so you understand what I'm choosing." "I understand," she said. "Why are you choosing it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I misread that clause to him," Franklin said. "And I knew what I was doing when I did it. And I've been sitting with that since the morning you came in here and put the document on my desk." He picked up a pen. "Let me read these statutes properly. Come back tomorrow morning." She came back the next morning. Franklin had prepared a formal response to the assessor's complaint, 12 pages, precise and thoroughly sourced, with citations she would not have known to look for and arguments she would not have known to make. He walked her through it at his desk, page by page, explaining each point in language she could follow, which told her he had decided to treat her as someone who deserved to understand what was being done on her behalf rather than simply benefit from it. When they finished, she said, "What do I owe you?" "Nothing," he said. "Franklin, call it a correction," he said. "For October." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more specifically than she usually meant it. She filed the response with the county assessor herself, walked it into the office on a Thursday morning, handed it to the clerk, and watched the clerk's eyes move across the first page with the slow, careful attention of someone who recognized they were reading something substantial. "This will go to the assessor for review," the clerk said. "I understand," Margaret said. "I'll wait for his decision." She walked out. She was halfway down the courthouse steps when she nearly walked directly into Warren Caldwell. He caught her arm to steady her, a brief, reflexive gesture, and released it immediately, which was proper. But the warmth of that contact remained in her sleeve for a moment in a way she noticed and then set aside, because she was not in a position to examine that kind of thing in the middle of a courthouse staircase. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, "are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "I just filed my response to Vance's complaint." Something moved across his face, relief, she thought, or something close to it. "I heard about the filing," he said. "The whole town heard about it by yesterday evening." He paused. "I went to see Hargrove this morning." She looked at him. "What for?" "To tell him what Vance has been doing," Caldwell said. "The barn, the Claus misrepresentation, the Henderson approach. All of it." He said it without ceremony, the way he had been saying difficult things lately, directly, without performance. "Hargrove should know that someone is running a pressure campaign against a legitimate business in this county, and that the bank's name was used in it without authorization." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't have to." They stood on the courthouse steps in the November cold, and around them Harrow Creek moved in its ordinary morning rhythms. And inside the ordinary morning, Margaret felt something shift that had been shifting gradually for weeks, the very slow movement of a thing that had no name yet, but was becoming one. "I'd like to ask you something," Caldwell said, "and I'd understand if you'd rather I didn't." "Ask it," she said. "Would you have supper with me?" he said. "Not as a business discussion. Not to talk about Vance or the assessor or the water rights." He paused. "Just supper." The courthouse steps were cold. Her ledger was under her arm. She had a farm to get back to, and a complaint pending review, and a winter season to plan, and approximately 11 things that needed her attention before dark. She looked at Warren Caldwell. She thought about what she had observed of him over 8 months on the dock in April, when he had handed her $3, and looked at her in the Trading Post in October, when he had named his price without arguing, in the street when he had told her about Vance's threat without being asked to. She thought about the handshake that had changed, the first one brief and dismissive, the last one something more like equals. She thought about the dark, in the middle of November, after Agatha drove away, when she had allowed herself to think he is a decent man, and then gone to sleep. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. Something in his face went quieter, the way a person's face went when something they had been uncertain about was resolved. "Saturday evening," he said. "The hotel dining room. 7 o'clock, if that suits you." "It suits me," she said. She walked to her wagon. She did not look back. But for the first time in a very long time, not looking back had nothing to do with pride or survival, or the discipline of not caring what followed her. It was simply that she was looking forward. The assessor's decision came on a Friday. Margaret was in the barn when Billy Marsh arrived, not running this time, not electric with news, but walking with the careful steadiness of someone who has been told to deliver something important and has decided to take it seriously. He handed her an envelope. She opened it standing in the barn doorway. The county assessor had reviewed the complaint filed by Cornelius Vance and the response filed by Margaret Ellison, and had found the complaint without sufficient merit to warrant a cease order. The Ellison operation was found to be in compliance with county agricultural statutes. The complaint was dismissed. She read it twice, then she folded it. Then she did something she had not done in 8 months. She sat down on the crate in the barn doorway, pressed the letter flat against her chest, closed her eyes, and cried. Not from grief, not from exhaustion, from the specific, accumulated weight of everything she had carried since April, being set down all at once: the debt, the mockery, the barn break-in, the bank threats, the Vance campaign. The months of being told in every possible register that she was wrong about herself, all of it releasing at once into the cold November air. Billy Marsh stood a respectful distance away and looked at his boots. After a minute, Margaret wiped her face with the back of her hand, folded the envelope into her pocket, and stood up. "Thank you, Billy," she said. Her voice was completely steady. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and tipped his hat and walked back to his horse with the careful dignity of a 15-year-old who had just witnessed something he understood was significant and had handled it exactly right. That afternoon Vance came. She had expected this. After the dismissal, after everything that had been moved against her had failed, she had known he would come, not to try again, but to do the thing that men like Vance did when they lost, which was to make certain the person who beat them understood that it had cost him something, and that he wanted them to know it. He arrived at her farm gate without his carriage this time. He had come in a hired wagon, which told her the visit was not official. He was not here as a businessman, but as a man, and the distinction mattered. She came out of the barn and stood in the yard and waited. He walked up to the gate and stopped there, which was correct. He had not been invited past the gate. "You won," he said. No preamble. "I was right," Margaret said. "That's different." He looked at her. His broad, pleasant face was not pleasant today. It was the face of someone who had underestimated something and was in the process of understanding how comprehensively he had done so. "I came to tell you that the distribution contract with Caldwell's Trading Post stands," he said. I withdrew the threat. He paused. "It was a bad move. I used pressure I shouldn't have used." "You used it because you thought I couldn't answer it," Margaret said. "Yes," he said, "I did." "Mr. Vance," she said, "why did you want my operation under contract badly enough to do all of this?" He was quiet for a moment, genuinely quiet, not the calculated pauses of their first conversation, but the actual silence of someone deciding whether to say a true thing. "Because it's exceptional," he said. "The product. What you built here in one season, with no capital and no connections, and an entire telling you it couldn't be done." He said it without warmth, but with something that was at least accurate. "I've been in this business for 20 years. I know what exceptional looks like, and I know that exceptional people with no resources can be directed. Given an offer that sounds like security and is actually control." He paused. "You saw through it faster than anyone I've dealt with." "I read the offer," Margaret said. "That's all. Most people don't read things carefully enough," Vance said. "You do." He reached into his coat and produced a card. He held it out over the gate. "If you ever want to discuss a contract at market rate and actual market rate, with actual terms, I'm reachable through that address." She looked at the card. She took it. She didn't put it in her pocket. She held it in her hand where they could both see it, which was its own kind of answer, not yes and not no and not yet, but I'm keeping my options, and you should know that I know what they are. Vance nodded. He walked back to the hired wagon and drove away. She stood at the gate until he was gone. Then she went inside and put his card in the ledger, between the pages covering October's sales. Evidence, she thought. Or possibility, she hadn't decided which yet. Saturday came. She had not told Dorothy about the supper invitation. She had not told Agatha. She had not told anyone. Partly because she was a private woman, and partly because the thing she had said yes to was still new enough that she wanted to hold it quietly for a few days before she allowed the town of Harrow Creek to form an opinion about it. She put on her good dress, the dark blue one she had worn to church before she stopped going regularly, before the mornings became too complicated for the performance of normalcy that church required. She brushed her hair and put it up the way she had worn it when Thomas was alive. When there had been someone else in the house, and getting dressed in the morning had been for a reason beyond pure necessity. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. She was 30 years old. She was large. She had been a widow for almost 3 years. She had permanent calluses on both palms that no amount of attention was going to resolve before Saturday evening. She had spent 8 months building something from nothing and had succeeded past what she had let herself hope for. And she was going to have supper with a man who had started this year by handing her $3 for a problem and had ended it standing up for her at the county assessor's office. She looked at herself for a long time. Then she pinched some color into her cheeks, put on her coat, and went. The hotel dining room was warm and smelled of good food and wood polish. Caldwell was already there when she arrived. He stood when she came in, which was courtesy she hadn't expected, and found she was glad of. They sat across from each other with the lamp between them and the ordinary sounds of a hotel dining room around them. And it was awkward for approximately 30 seconds, the specific awkwardness of two people who have known each other in one context, discovering they are now in a different one. Then Caldwell said, "I owe you a better apology than the one I gave you on the Trading Post floor in October." Margaret picked up her water glass. "You apologized." "I accepted it. I apologized for how I spoke to you on the dock," he said. "I didn't apologize for why. For the fact that I looked at you in April, a capable, intelligent woman who had clearly thought through what she was doing and decided without asking a single question that you were making a mistake." He paused. "That wasn't just bad manners. That was a failure of basic respect." She put her glass down. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because I want to be honest with you," he said. "And I don't know how to do that without starting from what's true." She looked at him across the lamp. He was not a perfect man. She had established that clearly enough across 8 months of close observation. He was a man who had been shaped by a world that taught men to look at women like her and see limitation rather than capacity, and he had looked that way until the evidence became impossible to ignore. That was not a flattering story about him, but it was an honest one. And he was telling it. She thought about Thomas, who had believed in her from the beginning. She thought about the difference between belief that cost nothing and belief that required you to correct yourself, and which one was harder and which one meant more. "You're forgiven," she said, properly this time. Something in his face went warm. "Thank you," he said. They ate supper. They talked for 2 hours, not about Vance, not about the assessor, not about water rights or barrel counts or bank deadlines. They talked about his trading post, which he had built from a smaller operation his father had left him 20 years ago. They talked about her grandmother Ruth and the Pennsylvania cellar and the lesson that had saved her this year. They talked about Harrow Creek and what it was like to have lived your whole life in a place that knew everything about you, and the particular freedom and particular loneliness of that. He asked her what she planned for next season. She told him. He listened, not with the polite half-attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but with actual attention, the kind that asked questions and remembered answers, and returned to things she had said earlier to make connections. It was the kind of listening she had been starved for. She had not realized how hungry she was for it until she felt it and recognized the hunger only by its being satisfied. When they walked out of the hotel at 9 o'clock, the night was cold and clear, and Main Street was quiet, and Harrow Creek lay around them in its ordinary stillness. He walked her to her wagon. At the wagon he said, "I'd like to do this again." She untied Clover's lead from the post. "Supper, conversation," he said. "Supper too, if you'll have it. But mostly this." He gestured between them, a simple motion that managed to indicate something specific. "This kind of talking, with someone who talks back." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the tin under the floorboard, about the debt that was almost cleared, about the ledger full of 8 months of careful documentation the evidence of everything she had figured out alone. About Agatha's 5-mile drive and Henderson's letter and Franklin's 12-page response and Dorothy's fence line warnings. About all the ways this year had shown her who people were when it cost them something to show her. She thought about a decent man who stood when she walked into a room and listened when she talked, and had told her the truth about a threat without being asked to. "All right," she said. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. He stepped back and waited until she had the reins settled. "Good night, Margaret," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it land somewhere in her chest with a quietness that was its own kind of significant. "Good night, Warren," she said. She drove home in the November dark, with Clover steady under the reins and the cold air against her face and the sound of the town falling away behind her. And she thought about what it meant to have survived a year that had tried in every possible way to end her, and to have come out the other side with not just the farm and the business and the debt cleared, but something she hadn't put in the ledger. Something she hadn't known to document. The sense that the story wasn't over. The sense, quiet and certain and more solid than anything she had built from $3.40 ruined barrels, that what was ahead of her was not a remainder of a life she had barely kept. It was a beginning. The last payment to First Mercantile Bank of Harrow Creek was made on the 28th of November, 1856. Margaret handed the money to Edgar Hargrove across his desk, and he counted it and recorded it in his ledger, and stamped the loan document paid in full, with a finality that made a sound she wanted to hear twice. She asked him to stamp it again. He looked at her. She looked back. He stamped it again. She walked out of that bank with the stamped document in her hands and stood on the front step in the November cold and felt the last of the weight leave her shoulders, not gradually, not in stages, but all at once. The way the sky cleared after a long storm, sudden and complete and almost shockingly bright. She stood there for a long moment. Then she folded the document carefully, put it in her pocket, and went home to plan next season. The winter of 1856 came in hard and stayed. Margaret didn't mind. She had fuel enough, food enough, and for the first time in 3 years, money enough the tin under the kitchen floorboard held operating funds for the full season, and then some. And the knowledge that it was there changed the quality of the dark, the way a good lock changed the quality of a door. It was still dark, but it was a different kind of dark. The kind you could rest in rather than lie awake inside of. She spent December the way she had always believed December should be spent, working steadily through the things that the busy seasons never left room for. She repaired the barn loft properly, with new timber and real nails instead of the improvised patchwork that had been holding it since Thomas died. She replaced the cracked window glass. She remortared the kitchen hearth. She went through Thomas's ledger from the beginning, not her entries, the old columns from when he was alive, and read the whole thing slowly, the way you read something that belongs to someone you loved, looking for the person in the numbers, finding him there in the careful handwriting and the notations in the margins. She cried once quietly, on a December Tuesday, and then she closed the ledger and made herself supper. She and Warren had supper again in December, twice at the hotel, and once at her kitchen table when he arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with the stated purpose of discussing a potential joint purchasing arrangement for the spring apple season, and the unstated purpose of spending 3 hours in her kitchen talking about everything except apple purchasing, which they did, and which she found she was completely comfortable with by the time he drove away in the winter dark. He was careful with her. Not in the way of a man who doubted her. She had been careful about watching for that, the carefulness that was really condescension dressed up as consideration. This was different. This was the carefulness of a man who understood that the person across from him had been through something significant and had earned the right to set the pace of whatever came next. She appreciated it more than she knew how to say. So she showed it instead, the way she showed most things, by being present. By listening the way he listened, by asking the questions that told him she had remembered what he had said the time before. By letting him in by degrees, the way you let warmth into a room that had been cold for a long time, opening the window a little at a time so the shock of it didn't undo you. January brought its own complications. The first one arrived in the form of a letter from a wholesale buyer in Syracuse, a company called Renner and Associates that had apparently heard about her operation from Caldwell's Albany contacts, which meant word had traveled farther than she had realized, which was both encouraging and slightly alarming in the way that unexpected attention was always slightly alarming. The letter offered to purchase her entire next season's production, sight unseen, at a price that was 20% above the rate she had gotten from her local buyers. She read the letter 3 times. Then she rode to see Agatha. Agatha read the letter once, folded it, handed it back. "What's your hesitation?" Agatha said. "Entire season's production," Margaret said. "One buyer. If they pull out, I have no distribution. If they reduce the price after I've committed, I have no leverage." "What does the letter say about contract terms?" "It doesn't. It's an expression of interest. The actual terms would be negotiated." Agatha looked at her steadily. "Then negotiate them." "I don't know how to negotiate a wholesale contract," Margaret said. "You negotiated Franklin Deere into a corner using a loan document you read 4 times, Agatha said. "You turned down Cornelius Vance's offer while he was standing in your yard. You walked into a bank meeting and held your ground for 40 minutes. She paused. "What exactly do you think negotiating a contract requires that you don't already have?" Margaret was quiet. "Someone who's done it before," she said. Agatha's expression did the thing that was adjacent to a smile. "You know someone who's done it before," she said. She meant Caldwell. Margaret drove to the trading post the next morning. She found him in the back doing inventory, and she put the Renner letter on the top of the crate he was working from and waited while he read it. He read it twice. He looked up. "Syracuse," he said. "Yes. What do you want to do?" "I want to respond," she said. "But I want to understand what I'm agreeing to before I agree to it. I've never negotiated a wholesale contract, and I don't want to discover the gaps in my knowledge after the document is signed." He nodded slowly. He was not performing consideration, he was actually considering, going through something in his mind, and she waited because she had learned that his thinking was worth waiting for. "There are 4 things you need to protect," he said. "Price floor, a minimum below which they cannot renegotiate, even if the market drops. Quantity flexibility, the right to sell up to 15% of your production to local buyers without violating the contract. Quality dispute resolution, a specific documented process, so that if they claim the product is below standard, there's an independent assessment rather than their word against yours." He paused. "And exit terms. If they fail to pay, how quickly can you get out and sell elsewhere?" Margaret had been writing in her pocket ledger as he spoke. "Is there a standard language for these provisions?" she said. "Franklin Deere would know the standard language," Caldwell said. She looked up from the ledger. "You're sending me back to Franklin Deere," she said. "He already owes you a debt," Caldwell said. "Use it." She went to Franklin that afternoon. Franklin read the Renner letter with the expression of a man who was being given an opportunity to be useful in a straightforward way and was visibly relieved by the simplicity of it. "I can draft a response that proposes these terms," he said, looking at her notes. "Standard wholesale language, protective clauses, nothing aggressive, just firm." He looked up. "This is a solid operation to be representing Mrs. Ellison. Renner doesn't contact small producers unless they've heard something worth hearing." "What does that mean for the negotiation?" she asked. "It means they want what you have," Franklin said. "Which means you have more leverage than the letter implies. They reached out to you. That changes the balance." She had not thought about it in those terms. She sat with it for a moment, letting it rearrange the picture she had been carrying, the picture of herself as someone who had gotten lucky, who had stumbled into success through a combination of her grandmother's knowledge and one catastrophic warehouse fire and 6 months of stubborn refusal to quit. The picture that Vance and Pruitt and Holt and the Harrow Creek Sewing Circle had helped paint, and that she had never fully been able to take down. Renner and Associates had heard about her. They had sought her out. Not because of the Whitfield fire. Not because of luck. Because someone in Albany had tasted her product and told someone in Syracuse about it, and that person had put her name in a letter. She was, it turned out, a producer worth seeking. She let herself believe that. Just for a moment. Just long enough for it to settle into something she could build on. Draft the response, she said. Franklin had it ready in 2 days. She read it carefully, every clause, every provision, every piece of standard language, and asked 3 questions about things she didn't understand. And Franklin answered all 3 without making her feel that she should have known, which she appreciated enough to tell him so. She signed it and sent it to Syracuse on a Friday. The response came back in 10 days, which was fast enough to tell her that Franklin had been right about the leverage. Renner had agreed to every provision except the quantity flexibility clause, which they wanted reduced from 15% to 10%. She wrote back and proposed 12%. They accepted. She held the signed contract in her hands on a January evening and read her own name at the bottom of it, Margaret Ellison, Harrow Creek, New York, in the context of a 2-year wholesale agreement with a Syracuse trading company, and felt something that was entirely new and entirely right. She put the contract in the tin under the kitchen floorboard. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and wrote in the ledger. January 29, 1857. Renner and Associates contract signed. 2-year wholesale agreement at confirmed market rate plus premium. First season delivery begins April. She underlined the last line. Then she wrote underneath it, smaller, in the margin. Grandma Ruth would have had something to say about this. She closed the ledger and went to bed and slept straight through until morning. February was when the town shifted. Not all at once, and not without the occasional backsliding misses. Harker's Sewing Circle had several members who had invested too much in the original story of Margaret Ellison to abandon it comfortably, and there were mornings when she still caught the sideways look, the slight recalibration in someone's expression when they saw her coming. But the dominant register had changed. It had changed the way Holt had changed on the courthouse steps, not dramatically, not with speeches, but with the small practical adjustments of people who had decided that the story they were telling about someone needed updating. Gerald Patterson stopped adding the faint qualifier to his recommendations of her product. He had been telling customers it was quite good for a local operation, and he shifted, without announcement, to simply saying it was good. That was a more significant change than it sounded. James Pruitt said good morning to her on the street one Tuesday without the particular intonation that had always made his greetings feel like challenges, and she said good morning back, and they both continued walking. And it was the most ordinary exchange and the most remarkable one. Dorothy came for coffee and stayed for 3 hours and talked about things other than Margaret's situation, which meant Margaret had stopped being Dorothy's project and had become her friend. That distinction mattered more than anything Gerald Patterson had ever said about her vinegar. The moment that stopped her still, though, was a Thursday morning in late February, when she was at Patterson's picking up supplies, and a woman she didn't know well, a Mrs. Lattimore, who had moved to Harrow Creek from Albany the previous year and had therefore missed the entire history of what the town had decided about Margaret, pointed to a jar of vinegar on the shelf and said to her husband, "That's from the Ellison farm. Everyone says it's the best in the county." Margaret was standing 4 feet away. Mrs. Lattimore had no idea. Margaret paid for her supplies and walked to her wagon, and sat for a moment before picking up the reins, and thought about what it meant to have a reputation that traveled on its own without her needing to carry it. She had spent 8 months building something. She had not realized until this moment that it had started building her back. The spring came early. The apple trees budded in March, not the tentative, uncertain budding of the year before, but something more committed, more sure of itself. She stood among them one morning and looked at what a single year had done, the way growth worked when the conditions were right, and the roots held, and felt something so straightforward and so complete that she didn't try to name it. She just stood in the orchard and let it be. The second season's production began in April. She had expanded 2 additional barrels from Agatha's stock as starter culture, a partnership with a neighboring farm for additional apple supply that she had negotiated through the winter, and a refinement of her method that she had spent December developing based on the notes from the previous season's failures. The barn had been reorganized to optimize airflow in a way she had mapped out on paper and tested twice before committing to. Agatha came by in April and walked the barn with her, checking the setup with those sharp black eyes and the thoroughness of a woman who had not survived 71 years by accepting things at face value. "You fixed the corner problem," Agatha said, stopping at the section where barrel 22 and 31 had sat the previous season. "The positioning and the ventilation both," Margaret said. "And I'm monitoring temperature twice daily through the first 8 weeks." Agatha looked at the setup for a long moment. "Your grandmother would have done it the same way," she said. "Maybe better ventilation, but the same instinct." Margaret felt that land somewhere deep. "I'd like to think so," she said. Agatha turned and looked at her directly. "She would have been proud of you," she said. "Not for the vinegar, for what you understood about yourself when nobody else did." The barn was quiet. Margaret pressed her lips together and held herself steady, because she had cried on a December Tuesday and she had decided she was allowed 1 cry per season and she was saving the spring one. "Thank you, Agatha," she said. Agatha nodded briskly and went to check barrel number 4, which was her way of sentiment was expressed and recorded, and they could move on to work now. And Margaret followed her, because working alongside Agatha Whitmore was one of the privileges of her life, and she did not take it lightly. The twist that spring came from a direction she had not anticipated. It came from Cornelius Vance. Not in person, Vance had not returned to Harrow Creek since November. It came in the form of a letter, which arrived in April, on the same week she had introduced the mother culture to the first 12 barrels of the new season, and which she read standing at the kitchen table, still wearing her barn coat. Vance was writing to inform her that his distribution company was opening a regional office in the Hudson Valley and was seeking established producers to anchor their upstate New York supply network. He was offering her a position in that network, not as a contracted supplier with fixed pricing, not the arrangement he had tried to force on her the previous fall, but as a named producer with preferred pricing. The right to sell independently, up to 30% of her production, and what he called a reputation partnership, her name, associated with his distribution network in their marketing materials, giving her reach into markets she could not access alone. He enclosed a preliminary term sheet. She read it twice. Then she sat down. The previous October, he had come to her farm trying to undercut her pricing and use regulatory filings to force her into a position of dependence. He had failed, and in the intervening 6 months, he had apparently decided that the woman who had outmaneuvered him on every front was more valuable as a genuine partner than as a controlled supplier. She spent 3 days thinking about it. She talked to Agatha, who read the term sheet and said, "The reputational clause needs to be bidirectional. If his network's name is attached to your product, your name needs to be protected if his network's quality drops." She talked to Franklin, who identified 2 provisions that needed revision, and drafted the revisions in language that was firm without being hostile. She talked to Warren. This conversation happened at her kitchen table, on a Saturday, with coffee between them and the April light coming through the window she had replaced in December. She had gotten comfortable with these conversations, comfortable in the specific sense that she no longer spent any portion of them aware of herself from the outside, wondering what she looked like or whether she was taking up too much space. She was simply present, and he was simply present, and the space between them had become something she had stopped needing to measure. She put the Vance term sheet on the table and walked him through it. He read it carefully. He asked several questions that told her he had understood the structure of it quickly and was looking for the places she hadn't seen yet, which she appreciated because that was exactly what she needed from him. "The reputational clause is the important one," he said, looking up. "Agatha's right. You need protection running both directions." "Franklin is already revising it," she said. He nodded. "The market access is real," he said. "He has relationships in Albany, Syracuse, Rochester that would take you 5 years to build independently. If the terms are right," he set the paper down, "this could take you somewhere significant." "It could," she said. They were both quiet for a moment. "Are you afraid of significant?" he said. The question landed with the precision of something he had been holding for a while, waiting for the right moment, and she understood that it was not entirely about Vance's offer. She looked at him. "I spent most of last year being afraid of losing everything," she said. "I don't have much fear left over for gaining things." He smiled then, not the careful, considered expressions he usually gave her, but something more unguarded than that, something that had the quality of relief and something else underneath it. "Good," he said. She sent the revised term sheet to Vance the following week. He accepted every revision. She signed the agreement on a Tuesday in late April, exactly 1 year and 10 days after she had pressed 3 coins into her palm at Caldwell's dock. She did not make a ceremony of it. She signed it. She filed her copy with the rest of the documents in the tin, and she went back to the barn and checked her barrels and wrote in the ledger. But that evening, when the work was done and the barn was closed and the April dark had come in full, she sat at the kitchen table and allowed herself to look at where she was. 1 year ago, $63 of debt, $11 in the tin, a leaning fence post, 2 hens and one that had stopped laying, a town that had made up its mind about her. Now debt cleared, fence post solid, hens productive. Wholesale contract with Syracuse. Distribution agreement with a regional network that would put her product in markets she had never imagined standing at Caldwell's dock that April morning. A ledger full of documentation that had twice protected her from threats she hadn't seen coming. A neighbor who had become her ally. A lawyer who owed her an honest debt and was paying it. An old woman who had given her knowledge and expected growth in return and was getting it. And Warren. She let herself think about Warren without the careful bracketing she had been applying all winter, the disciplined containment of someone who had learned the hard way what it cost to build something on uncertain ground. She let herself think about the evenings at the kitchen table and the way he listened and the handshake that had become a handshake between equals and the moment on the courthouse steps and the hotel dining room and the night he had said her given name. She thought about what it meant to have earned, through a year of work that nobody watched and everybody doubted, the particular freedom of knowing your own value. Not because someone told you, not because circumstance forced it into evidence, but because you had sat in a barn on a Saturday in August and tasted something and known, in the precision of your own judgment, that it was exceptional. She knew what she was worth, and she knew what she wanted. On a Saturday in May, when the apple trees were fully leafed and the second season's production was running cleanly 15 mini-climaxes of monitoring, adjusting. The daily arithmetic of turning patience into product. Warren Caldwell drove up to her farm and did not have a stated business purpose. He simply arrived. She was in the orchard when she heard the wagon, and she came out with her hands dirty and her hair coming down from where she had pinned it and her barn coat open to the warm May air. And she did not apologize for any of it because she was done apologizing for who she was in the middle of her own working day. He climbed down from the wagon and looked at her across the yard with an expression that was the most unguarded she had ever seen on him, no calculation in it, no performance, no careful management of what he was presenting. Just a man looking at a woman he had been looking at for a year, and having apparently decided that the looking needed to be followed by something more direct. "I have something to say to you," he said. "Say it," she said. "I've been saying things in pieces," he said, "since October. In the street and at supper and at your kitchen table. And I think you've understood what I was saying between the pieces, and I think I've understood what you've been saying back." He paused. "But I'd like to say it plainly." The orchard was quiet around them. The May air moved through it. She stood with her dirty hands and her open coat and looked at Warren Caldwell standing at the edge of her yard. And she thought about the dock in April and the $3 and the laughter and every single thing that had happened between that moment and this one. "I'm in love with you," he said. "I've been watching you for a year build something that most people in this town didn't believe was possible, and I was one of those people until you proved me wrong. And you proved me wrong so thoroughly and so completely that it changed how I see." He stopped. Started again. "It changed how I see what a person is capable of. What you are capable of. And I would like, if you're willing, to spend a considerable amount of time finding out what else you're capable of." He held her gaze. Together. The word settled in the orchard air. Together. She had been alone for 3 years. She had built alone, survived alone, planned and documented and revised and held herself together alone, and she had done it. She had done every single piece of it, and she would have kept doing it. And she was not standing in this orchard because she needed someone to complete her. She was complete, but she was looking at a man who knew she was complete and wanted to stand beside it anyway. Not in front of it, not instead of it. Beside it the way you stood beside something that was already whole because you wanted the view. "I love you too, Warren," she said. "I have been, I think, since October. Possibly since the trading post floor." She paused. "Possibly since the dock, though I'd prefer you didn't tell anyone that last part." He laughed. She had heard him laugh before, but not like this, not this full, uncalculated, completely unguarded laugh that had nothing professional or careful in it at all. Just a man who had just heard something wonderful. He crossed the yard. He took her hands dirty from the orchard and held them, and she let him. "I want to do this right," he said. "Court you properly. Ask you things in the right order. You can ask me whatever you want," she said. "In whatever order you want. Will you marry me?" he said. There was no pause, no breath, no careful consideration. "Yes," she said. And that was that. He was at the farm for supper that evening, and the next morning she told Agatha, who received the news with the expression of a woman who had seen this coming for 6 months and had been waiting with the particular patience of someone who knows the timing isn't theirs to control. "Good," Agatha said. "That's all you have to say," Margaret said. "You want me to say more? I thought you might have feelings about it." Agatha looked at her. "He stood up for you at the assessor's office," she said. "He told you about Vance's threat when he didn't have to. He sat at your kitchen table and listened to you think." She paused. "Any woman who can read a loan document 4 times can identify a decent man when she's looking at one." Margaret smiled. "I'm going to need your help with the wedding," she said. "I'm 71 years old," Agatha said. "I know." "Will you help me anyway?" Agatha was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Obviously." Dorothy cried when Margaret told her, which Margaret had expected. Dorothy was a woman who felt things in full and expressed them at volume, and this was one of her genuine strengths, even when it was inconvenient. She cried for approximately 90 seconds, and then collected herself and immediately began making a list of things to organize, which was the other side of her, and equally useful. They were married in June. Not a large ceremony. Margaret had not wanted large, and Warren had not argued. The important people were there. Agatha, sitting in the front row with the posture of a woman who had not wasted 71 years on poor posture and wasn't about to start now. Dorothy, who cried again, contained it to under a minute this time, and was clearly proud of herself. Franklin Deere, who stood at the back and looked like a man who had gotten something right after a period of getting things wrong and found the feeling agreeable. Billy Marsh, who had been invited because he had brought 2 pieces of news that changed everything and deserved to be present when the change finished arriving at its destination. Elias Henderson came. He stood at the edge of the gathering with his hat in his hands, a big, weathered man who looked like he had grown up out of the same soil he worked. And when Margaret caught his eye, he nodded at her with the particular gravity of someone acknowledging that didn't need words. She nodded back. Holt came. He stood near the back and said nothing to anyone, and left immediately after, which was exactly the right amount of Holt for the occasion. Gerald Patterson brought a gift, a set of good glass jars, the kind used for storing fine vinegar, which was the most thoughtful gift she received, and which she told him directly. And he turned red and looked at his boots, and she understood that he had thought about it for a long time before choosing. Cornelius Vance was not there, but in the Morning Post, the day after the wedding, there was a letter from his office, a single page, formal in its language, congratulating her on the occasion and noting that her first quarterly premium payment under their distribution agreement had been processed and was en route. She read it at the kitchen table, her kitchen table, which was now also Warren's kitchen table, in the house that was now theirs, together, and thought that this was probably the most appropriate wedding gift Vance could have sent. She put the letter in the ledger. The summer was full. Production running. Renner payments arriving on schedule. Vance's network placing her product in 3 new markets by August. The farm expanding not dramatically, not beyond what she could manage with clear eyes and careful math, but expanding. A second worker hired part-time for harvest season. Correspondence from 2 producers in neighboring counties who had heard about her method and wanted to talk. She had become someone people sought out. She let that be true. She let it be true without diminishing it and without letting it make her careless, because she had learned in the most thorough possible way that the distance between exceptional and lost was exactly the distance between attention and assumption, and she was not going to become someone who assumed. In September, 1 year to the month from the morning, Billy Marsh had arrived with news of the Whitfield fire. Margaret went up to the barn loft to do her monitoring. She had the small spoon in her apron pocket, and the ledger under her arm, and the quiet, competent certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and exactly why. She checked barrel after barrel, made her notes, observed, recorded, adjusted where needed. She was at the last barrel, number 35, this season, when she heard Warren's voice from below. "How does it look?" She leaned down through the loft hatch. He was standing in the barn with his coat on, just arrived from the trading post, looking up at her with the ease of a man in a place where he was welcome. "Exceptional," she said. "It always is," he said. She climbed down. They walked out of the barn together into the September afternoon, and the orchard was full with the season's apples, and the fence posts stood straight along every edge of the property. And the tin under the kitchen floorboard held more money than she had ever had in her life, and the ledger on the kitchen shelf was full of 2 years of careful handwriting, the evidence of everything she had learned, everything she had fought for, everything she had refused to give up on, even when the entire world was cheerfully explaining to her why she should. She thought about April of last year. $3. 40 barrels of rot. A dock full of laughing men. She thought about what it would have looked like to someone standing on that dock, watching a large woman in a plain dress load ruined barrels onto an old wagon while men laughed behind her. If you had tried to tell them what that woman would be standing in 1 year and 5 months later, they would not have believed you. She would not have blamed them. Believing in a thing before the evidence arrived was its own kind of courage, and not everyone had it, and she had learned not to expect it from the world at large. She had learned to supply it for herself. Warren reached over and took her hand, standing there in the September yard, and she let him hold it and held it back, and they stood together looking at the orchard and the farm, and the whole small, solid, exceptional life she had built from something everyone else had thrown away. 3 coins, 40 barrels. One woman who understood that worthless and not yet were 2 entirely different things, and that the distance between them was exactly as long as you were willing to make it. She had made it the length of a year. She had made it the length of herself. And standing in the September light, with her ledger full, and her debt gone, and her orchard heavy with apples and the man she loved beside her, Margaret Ellison understood something that she would keep for the rest of her life, as clearly as she carried her grandmother's lesson, as clearly as she carried the memory of those 3 coins pressing into her palm. No one gives a woman like her a chance. She builds one. And once she builds it, not one single person in this world has the power to take it from her.